Hello everyone and welcome to this tutorial on the evidence hierarchy in healthcare. This is an important discussion for healthcare professionals and anyone involved in critical appraisal, doing academic medical writing, or for medical affairs in the pharmaceutical industry, who are always using evidence-based medicine to build the scientific arguments. In fact, every major decision in medicine, like for example approving a new medication, updating guidelines, or deciding on reimbursement, all these decisions comes down to the evidence hierarchy. Because the truth is that not all scientific evidence has the same strength. For example, a single case report may raise an important question, but it will not change the practice. A large randomized trial or a systematic review, on the other hand, can completely reshape how we think of the disease and how we treat patients. And today, with the evolution of real-world evidence, we can now see how treatments perform beyond even clinical trials. So in this session, we will understand the structure of the evidence pyramid, its strengths, and how it connects to the modern decision-making in healthcare. And let's start with the concept of the evidence hierarchy, which is simple and powerful. The concept of this pyramid is that we rank different types of studies according to how reliable their conclusions are. At the base sit expert opinions, case reports, and case series. These are valuable for providing early insights, but they are prone to bias. Then comes the observational studies, followed by randomized controlled trials, which are the gold standard of determining cause and effect. At the very top of the pyramid sits systematic reviews and meta-analysis, which combine multiple studies to provide the strong evidence possible. This hierarchy matters because, as mentioned before, all decisions in healthcare and in medicine carry real consequences about patient safety, costs, and approvals, and they all depend on high-quality evidence. Let's dig deeper into the pyramid of evidence. As mentioned, at the bottom of the pyramid, there are case reports, case series, and expert opinions, which help raise questions or describe unique situations or experiences, but their conclusions are limited because they are based on clinical judgment and they are prone to bias. A case report is a detailed description of a single patient's medical situation, how they are presented, what diagnosis was made, how they were treated, and what the outcome was. Its purpose is mainly to highlight something unusual or new that clinicians have observed, such as a rare disease, an unexpected side effect, or a novel response to a treatment. Often, a case report is where new medical ideas begin. For example, a clinician notices that one patient developed a rare skin reaction after taking a new medication. The clinician here will write and publish a case report describing the symptoms, treatments, and possible link to the drug. This is called a case report. A case series is like an expanded version of a case report. It describes a group of patients with a similar condition or a similar treatment or a similar outcome without using any control or comparison group. The purpose here is to summarize common findings across several patients, to identify patterns or trends that might not be obvious from a single case. For example, a hospital treats 10 patients who all experience the same rare liver toxicity from a specific cancer drug. Publishing those results together help other clinicians to recognize the same risk early in the practice. This is called case series. On the other hand, the expert opinion refers to conclusions or recommendations made by specialists or consultants based on their experience, or based on their interpretation of existing data, or even based on consensus discussions. But they don't depend actually on any new experimental evidence. The purpose here is to guide practice when there is no enough high-level evidence available, and to provide interpretation of the existing data. For example, a panel of cardiologists issue a consensus statement on how to manage a newly discovered heart condition, even though no randomized trials exist yet. In the middle of the pyramid, observational studies exist, like cohort studies or case control studies, which provide real-world insights, but they are still subject to confounding. Both cohort and case control studies are types of the observational research, meaning researchers observe what happens in real life instead of assigning treatments like in randomized trials. They are used when experiments are not ethical or practical or possible. For example, you cannot randomize people to smoking or not smoking in order to study a drug for lung cancer. Both types of research helps us to explore associations between exposure, like risk factors or treatments, and outcomes like the disease occurrence. But they differ in direction and design. Of course, we have a detailed tutorial on the classification of different types of studies by their design, which I will link it in the description of this video. At the top of the pyramid, randomized controlled trials sits, which eliminates the bias through randomization, showing cause and effect. And above all, systematic reviews and meta-analysis combine multiple trials to give a balanced, comprehensive view of the truth. So it's a journey from opinion or idea to actionable evidence. Randomized controlled trials are called the gold standard of clinical research for a reason. They reduce bias by balancing known and unknown factors, giving us confidence that the outcomes truly come from the treatment itself and not from any confounding factors. Randomized controlled trials form, in fact, the foundation of regulatory approvals and clinical guidelines. For example, think of the modern immunotherapy in oncology. These drugs were adopted based on robust randomized evidence proving survival benefit. However, despite that they are the gold standards in clinical research, randomized controlled trials have limitations. They are expensive, often costing hundreds of millions of dollars, and they take long time in order to complete, years. They also apply strict inclusion and exclusion criteria, which excludes specific patient populations like elderly or pregnant females, and this in fact limits the generalizability of those randomized controlled trials. And as we mentioned before, this setting of clinical trials is not necessarily matching real life, because in real life patients skip medications or skip doses. Doctors differ in their clinical practice, and healthcare system may add or impose additional barriers. This means that even results from those clinical trials, randomized controlled trials, may not fully match the clinical reality. And don't forget to add to this that trials cannot answer some basic questions like what about the long-term safety, or is there any rare events that might happen in reality? That's why, and because of these limitations, we need real-world evidence. In fact, real-world evidence plays a crucial role in the hierarchy of evidence. It uses data from different resources to understand how treatments work in routine practice, in real life. Real-world evidence doesn't replace randomized controlled trials. It complements them, answering the question, does it really work? Does it work in the real world? It tells us how therapies perform in diverse, complex patients, those often excluded from the clinical trials, and it gives us full picture on the treatment impact. For several years, real-world data was seen as too messy or biased. But with the advancement of technology, digital health records, artificial intelligence analytics, and access to millions of data points, that perceptions completely change. Regulators like FDA and EMEA now actively use real-world evidence for approvals and safety monitoring. Health technology assessment bodies across the globe rely on it for reimbursement decisions. So today, real-world evidence is no longer secondary. It's an essential evidence stream that shapes medical and policy decision globally. Real-world evidence comes, as I mentioned, from different variety of resources or sources, like electronic health records and registries, and these provide long-term, large-scale clinical information. Or from insurance claims, another example, which show the treatment patterns and costs. Or from digital health devices which monitor patients beyond the clinic walls, from heart rate to physical activity. And patient-reported outcomes that reveal quality of life, satisfaction, and adherence insights. These insights often invisible in trials. So together, these sources form a powerful ecosystem of data, reflecting healthcare as it truly happens. Over the last decade, every stakeholder has embraced real-world evidence. Regulators use it for post-marketing safety. Payers depend on it to measure cost effectiveness. The pharmaceutical industry leverages real-world evidence to identify unmet needs and support market access. And clinicians rely on it to guide the real-world decisions and to understand how therapies perform beyond the trial settings or the trial population. So we can say that real-world evidence is now a partner in every stage of healthcare decision-making. But like all evidence, real-world evidence has also strengths and challenges. Its strengths lie in diverse populations, long-term tracking, and practical relevance. But as expected, it's more vulnerable to bias and also data inconsistency. Here, patients are not randomized, and real-world data can be incomplete in some cases. That's why real-world evidence should complement, not replace, randomized controlled trials. Because together, randomized controlled trials and real-world evidence provide a complete, balanced view of efficacy and effectiveness. One question remains unanswered. Where does the real-world evidence lies on the pyramid of evidence? In fact, historically, real-world evidence was not part of the classical hierarchy at all, because the pyramid was built before modern digital data and analytics existed. However, in today's evidence-based practice, real-world evidence has earned its place, complementary, not inferior, complementary to traditional trials. In other words, the real strength of modern evidence lies in integration. Randomized controlled trials tell us if an intervention works under controlled settings. Real-world evidence shows us how it performs in everyday practice. Systematic reviews and meta-analysis bring these all together, providing the most reliable evidence and the most balanced view. For regulators and payers and clinicians, this integration drives smarter science and better outcomes for patients. As we close this session, remember this. No single type of evidence tells the full story. Randomized trials prove efficacy. On the other hand, systematic reviews provide the context. Real-world evidence shows relevance and reach. So together, they form this ecosystem of data or evidence that ensures science translates into real patient benefit. And for those of us working in medical affairs and healthcare, our mission is to integrate these insights and communicate them with clarity and credibility. That's what turns data into informed decisions and decisions into better patient outcomes. Thank you for your attention and see you in the next episode.